Hey, what's up, guys? Matilda Wormwood is an extremely intelligent girl. At just 12, she has already read hundreds of books, and she can conjure up tales in her head. She can also figure out tricky mathematical problems. Without a calculator, one might presume that she attends the top school in town, but in reality, the opposite is true. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, the haughty parents of Matilda, are still resentful that their child is a female. As a result, they make every effort to keep Matilda under control. They regularly make light of her interests, chastise her for trivial offenses, and, most importantly, refuse to let her attend school. With the aid of the books she gets from her neighbor and close friend, Mrs. Phelps, Matilda has acquired all of her intelligence. She has always had a smile on her face despite leading an odd existence. But one day, she eventually experiences a happy event. Two teachers from a neighboring school stop by the Wormwood home to see if the kids are receiving a good education. The deceitful parents swiftly claim that their daughter has been homeschooled, but Miss Honey, the female teacher, quickly detects the lie. Later, when Matilda is alone, she asks if she wishes to attend school. The young child is afraid of her parents, but Miss Honey assures her that if she enters, she will receive literature instruction. Matilda is eventually persuaded by this, and she agrees before ascending. Later, she is perusing a book in her room as usual when her haughty dad interrupts. She receives criticism from him for talking to the teacher and defying his tale. Then he says that she will be sent to Cruncham Hall, the most infamous school in town, as punishment. Agatha Trenchbull, the headmistress, is a large, menacing past champion at throwing a hammer. She has a very unique way of controlling kids by brutally punishing them. It's clear that Matilda is afraid of being sent to Cruncham Hall, so she devises a scheme to avenge her father. She later sneaks into her parents' room to mix their cosmetics while they are viewing television. Shortly after, Mr. Wormwood shows up and gives him a serum head massage. But when he looks in the mirror, he discovers that his hair has entirely turned green. He is surprised by this. He then goes to face Matilda but discovers her dozing off. Her father steps away in disbelief, not realizing that his daughter is merely acting asleep. Matilda wakes up early the following morning and makes her way to her new classroom. When she gets there, she discovers that the gates have not yet been unlocked. Mrs. Phelps, her closest friend, recognizes her and informs her that she is actually an hour early. Now that she has nothing to do, Matilda chooses to tell a recently created story. Mrs. Phelps, who enjoys reading as well, agrees right away, and the narrative begins. Once upon a time, a renowned escape artist fell in love with a stunning acrobat. Both of them were professionals of their respective trades, and a number of people admired them. They soon got married and began touring together. They were still unhappy, though, because they lacked one thing, a kid. Years rolled by without a solution. So, in order to distract themselves from it, they devised a risky plan that would undoubtedly grab global attention. The couple made the announcement that they would perform the riskiest stunt in the world one day in front of a sizable circus crowd. It's referred to as the Burning Lady, hurling through the air over sharks and jagged objects captured by the man inside the cage while wearing dynamite in her hair. Although it seems absurd, the heading needs some improvement. Mrs. Phelps is now engrossed in the tale, but when she reveals what transpired next, "I'm not sure," says Matilda. She will need time to consider the remainder since she has a habit of making up stories. The gate eventually opens at that precise moment, allowing Matilda and a second new girl to enter. At the entryway is a sizable statue of Mrs. Trenchbull tossing a hammer ball. The other students surprise them with a musical performance as the two girls wander the area in awe. "Please, no." They said that there is no way out of the institution, that it is like a prison. Even though Mrs. Trenchbull is a vicious headmistress, one cannot escape from her. Before they finish, she will see to it that every student is beaten and brought to heel. After some time, Matilda makes it to her lesson, which just so happens to be being instructed by none other than Miss Honey. She is a compassionate and kind lady who adores spending time with kids, in contrast to Mrs. Trenchbull. Miss Honey requests Matilda to finish the algebra equations that the seniors wrote on the class board after hours. Instead of dusting it off with a duster, the young girl begins to work out the calculations. When Miss Honey sees that Matilda has properly solved every equation, she is in complete and utter disbelief. Miss Honey questions her about her hobbies after realizing she's not a typical female. In response, Matilda says she reads books like The Lord of the Rings. The entire class is shocked after hearing this. Miss Honey, who was present during the lesson, makes the decision to approach the headmistress and inform her of Matilda's ability. Then, we get our first glimpse of Mrs. Trenchbull. She's a gigantic lady, and she's got on an army uniform. Even from school, she excelled at hammer throwing, as evidenced by the numerous awards in her room. Mrs. Trenchbull is uninterested when Miss Honey uneasily informs her of the new girl. She doesn't want to educate any of her students or offer any of them special attention. She only wants to punish the pupils and make their lives difficult. Sounds like a song, don't you think? Okay, in the following scenario, Matilda eagerly tells her parents about her first day of school when she gets home, but they don't seem to be interested. Mr. Wormwood, who works as a car salesperson, recently sold a few high-end vehicles. He has made a sizable sum of money by forcibly altering their components, which pleases Mrs. Wormwood. The frank Matilda, however, is not at all pleased. She scolds her father for having extramarital affairs. And when he overhears, he grabs her book and rips it to pieces. Matilda is devastated, but she has the ideal plan for getting even. The following morning, she enters her parents' room uninvited once more and places a sizable quantity of glue inside her father's hat, after giving it to her father, who is unaware, who wore it nonchalantly and left for work. Later on at school, as Matilda is talking with her new friends, a scared boy unexpectedly shows up and asks for assistance. Mrs. Trenchpool now believes that the child was the one who spilled syrup on her chair. All the students are alarmed upon hearing this because they know that the boy will almost certainly be sent to Chokey, a harsh punishment box where the worst of the bad students are capsized. But Matilda maintains her composure and devises a strategy. She tells the terrified child to lie down and requests that all the students cover him with their coats. The moment he is completely hidden, Mrs. Trenchbull shows up to search for him. Matilda indicates that the boy became exhausted and passed out about 30 minutes ago while pointing straight at the stack of coats, in the hopes that it would shield him from the heat. They wrapped him up in coats. Yes, Mrs. Trenchbull is upset by this and really wants to discipline the child. She now turns to a young female with ponytails because she needs to let out her rage. Using the justification that she dislikes ponytails, Mrs. Trenchbull takes the girl by the hair and swings her around like a hammer. She launches the girl outside the boundaries of the school as everyone looks on in terror. Fortunately, she escapes unharmed and moves on as if nothing ever occurred. After school, Matilda runs into Mrs. Phelps and resumes her incomplete narrative. The escapologist and acrobat engaged a manager to assist with the promotions after they revealed their lethal stunt. She was the acrobat's stepsister, but she was constantly threatening and vicious. She also was a past hammer-throwing champion. Thousands of spectators learned that the performance wouldn't go as planned when the escapologist entered the stage and revealed that his wife was actually pregnant. After a brief delay, the audience burst into cheers. Everyone celebrated the couple's impending parenthood. The haughty manager, however, cut off the couple's touching moment and explained that the performance would have to go on because she had spent a lot of money on promotions. If not, she will report them to the authorities. The escapologist and the acrobat hesitantly got ready for the risky stunt at this point. Mrs. Phelps is interested in what occurs next, but like the previous instance, Matilda is unsure. Before leaving, she makes a promise to return the following day. The next day at school, Mrs. Trenchbull unexpectedly shows up as everyone is eating lunch in the cafeteria. She must have had her chocolate cake stolen and eaten. She calls out to the burglar to come out and be seen. A tiny, overweight boy burps loudly just then. And when the smell reaches Mrs. Trenchbull, she licks it and discovers that he is the perpetrator. She chooses to punish him out of rage. The lad only needs to finish the large chocolate cake that she has instructed her chefs to prepare. He will be sent to the Chokey if he doesn't comply. The odds are stacked against the child and the cake is enormous, but he is able to eat it whole with the help of his pals. The unexpected turn of events shocks Mrs. Trenchbull, but she refuses to give up. So, despite Matilda's best efforts to save him, she makes an excuse and drags the child to the Chokey. Matilda approaches Mrs. Phelps after school and begins telling her the rest of her tale. The acrobat and escapologist prepared their places before the stunt started. Although it was tense, they both managed to free themselves from their chains in the end. But just in time, destiny had something else planned for them. The acrobat fell to the floor after slipping accidentally, breaking many bones. However, she only managed to live long enough to carry the infant. The escapologist was heartbroken over the death of his wife, but he made a vow to provide his daughter with the finest life possible. But from there, things only get worse. The escapologist asked the evil boss to watch over his daughter because he was constantly preoccupied with work. His departure for employment. The woman forced the young girl to labor and tormented her constantly. But the escapologist eventually learned of this and vowed to exact vengeance. The last time anyone saw him was when he irately drove away in his vehicle. That evening, he didn't return home at all. Surprisingly, Matilda shifts a trash can without touching it while she is at home. It appears that her highly developed intellect is capable of telekinesis. The next day at school, Mrs. Trenchbull shows up wearing an odd uniform as Miss Honey is giving a lecture to everyone. She announces that physical education or phys ed courses will be held today. Upon hearing this, all of the pupils start to fear. However, Mrs. Trenchbull guides them to a field while singing an odd musical number that only serves to highlight her previous success. They eventually reach the field, which turns out to be a harsh colony. There are mines, barbed wire, and tall walls. The full course must be completed by the students without stopping. The brutality leaves Matilda stunned, so she devises a scheme. She requests that her companion Newt be placed inside Mrs. Trenchbull's water glass by her pals. The latter agrees, and the heartless headmistress explodes when she sees the Newton there. She attempts to punish each student right away, but a frustrated Matilda resists and calls her a bully. Then, using telekinesis, she takes up the same glass and strikes Mrs. Trenchbull in the head. At the same moment, the cunning Newt begins to move around while concealed inside her underwear. The haughty headmistress is sufficiently outraged by this to dash to her office. Matilda calls Miss Honey after all the pupils have left and shows off her newly discovered ability. The instructor is shocked by this, but she pledges to keep it a secret. The two chat about their interests and hobbies as they make their way home later. Matilda is invited to Miss Honey's house as their relationship deepens. In the midst of a forest, there is a tiny cottage. When Matilda asks about her parents, Miss Honey responds that she doesn't. When her mother died and her father vanished, she was a baby. Years later, when she was abandoned, her vile step-relative took her home away from her and left her here to rot. When Matilda learns this, she immediately visualizes the escapologist and the acrobat. Finally, she realizes that the tale she had been telling is a true one. Miss Honey is actually the offspring of the escapologist and the acrobat. She is even more determined than before to exact vengeance on the cruel headmistress. Matilda desires to overthrow her and take back Miss Honey's house, but her folks give her some bad news when she gets home. The Mafia is after the defective cars that Mr. Wormwood sold as a result of their discovery, so the complete family will be relocating to Spain the following day. When Matilda learns this, she sobs in sorrow. Although she doesn't want to go, she is forced to. However, she makes the decision to go to school in a dark chamber one last time the following day. All of the pupils have been called to the gym by Mrs. Trenchbull for a spelling bee. Simple principles apply. Anyone who misspells something will suffer the consequences inside the choky box. She then pulls one of these crates out, revealing that it contains severed thorns. The battle will soon start. Some students initially respond correctly because Miss Honey has instructed them well. Mrs. Trenchbull then mentions a lengthy term that isn't even real. She begins pulling the child to the choky when the child doesn't respond. However, the other pupils start rebelling right then. They intentionally choose incorrect responses because they think Mrs. Trenchbull can't discipline them all at once. To their dismay, however, the cunning headmistress has a number of chokies in position. When it seems as though all of the students will be disciplined, Matilda decides to take things into her own hands. She first writes on the board with the help of her abilities, telling Mrs. Trenchbull to leave. When the latter doesn't pay attention, Matilda joins a few neighboring chains to form a sizable humanoid figure. Mrs. Trenchbull is rendered helpless as the tall figure eliminates each choky one by one. Then Matilda makes her subsequent move. She ties Mrs. Trenchbull's hair into two ponytails before using them to begin swaying the woman. The haughty headmistress is propelled through the ceiling the next instant. That is how you resolve issues. Absolute crime. She loses her house keys when she gets to the surface and dashes away. When Miss Honey receives the keys, she is thrilled to be able to move back into her parents' house. Later, the entire class assembles to thank Matilda for evicting the insane lady. Their joy is short-lived, though, as Matilda's parents drive up and order her to get in. They only have 1 hour to get to the airport and board their flight. The young lady agrees grudgingly and walks over to them. But just then, Miss Honey appears and requests permission to protect Matilda from Mr. Wormwood. He is initially surprised, but after realizing that he will have one more individual to take care of, he agrees. Matilda agrees and gives her folks a proper farewell. She even removes her father's glued-on cap. As Matilda and Miss Honey arrive at their house, where the scapologist and the tumbler once lived, the movie comes to a close.